The ranger held up the plastic bag, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Inside was a single silver locket, tarnished by 3 winters of snow and rain. Silas felt his knees hit the dirt before he realized he had fallen. It had been 1,095 days since Clara walked around that bend in the trail and vanished into the white mist. They said the mountain took her. They said she was gone, but looking at that locket, Silas knew the mountain was finally ready to speak, even if the answer was something his heart wasn't strong enough to hear. The Great Smoky Mountains have a way of holding on to things. They say the smoke that rises from these ridges isn't just water vapor or the breath of the trees. The old-timers in Gatlinburg will tell you that the mist is a curtain, and sometimes, if you aren't careful, you step behind it and you simply don't come back. The mountains are ancient, older than the bones of the continent, and they have seen millions of people pass through their shadows. Most pass through safely. They take their photos, they breathe the pine-scented air, and they go home to their warm beds. But for Silas and Clara, the mountains were not just a destination. They were a sanctuary. Silas and Clara had been married for 25 years. They were the kind of couple that didn't need to speak to understand one another. A look, a touch of the hand, a nod, that was an entire conversation. They had raised 2 children, sent them off to college, and now, finally, they had time for themselves. They had planned this trip for months, an October hike to watch the leaves turn from green to burning red and gold. They chose a trail near Clingmans Dome, the highest point in the Smokies. It was supposed to be a celebration of a quarter-century of love. The morning they set out was perfect. The air was crisp, hovering just around 40 degrees. The kind of cold that wakes you up and makes you feel alive. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue. As they drove their sedan up the winding Newfound Gap Road, Silas remembers looking over at Clara. She was smiling, looking out the window as the trees whipped by. She had her hair tied back in a messy bun, strands of silver mixing with the brown, catching the morning light. She looked beautiful. He remembers thinking that he was the luckiest man on earth. He reached over and squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. That was the last time he would ever feel the warmth of her skin. They parked the car at the trailhead. It wasn't crowded yet. They had beaten the rush of tourists coming in from Pigeon Forge. They shouldered their packs. Silas carried the heavier gear, the water, the emergency kit, the lunch, while Clara carried her camera and a walking stick she had used for a decade. The trail was steep, winding up through a dense forest of spruce and fir. The smell was intoxicating damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp scent of evergreen. For the first hour, everything was normal. They stopped to take pictures of a small waterfall. They laughed about how out of shape they felt compared to their 20s, but anyone who knows the Smokies knows how quickly the weather turns. It's a moody landscape. Around noon, the blue sky began to fade, replaced by a thick, heavy grayness that seemed to roll down from the peaks like a slow avalanche. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes. "We should pick up the pace," Silas said, looking up at the canopy. The wind was picking up, rustling the dry leaves with a sound like whispering paper. Clara nodded, buttoning her fleece jacket all the way to her chin. "Just up to the ridge," she said. "I want to see the view." Then we turned back. They reached a section of the trail where the path narrowed. On the left was a steep incline of rock and moss. On the right, a sharp drop-off into a ravine filled with rhododendron. The fog had arrived now. It wasn't just mist, it was a whiteout. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. "Silas," Clara called out. She was only 10 steps ahead of him. "My bootlace is undone." "Hang on." Silas stopped. He watched her bend down. He took the opportunity to take a sip of water. He turned his back to the wind to shield his face, looking back down the trail they had just climbed. He heard the rustle of fabric. He heard the click of her walking stick against a stone. He heard the wind howling through the fir trees, a lonely, hollow sound. He capped his water bottle. "Ready?" he asked, turning back around. The trail in front of him was empty. Silas blinked. The fog was swirling, thick and white, moving like a living thing. "Clara?" he said. His voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the vastness of the woods. He took a few steps forward. "Clara, stop joking. It's too cold." He walked to where she had been standing. The ground was muddy from the moisture in the air. He could see the imprint of her boot where she had knelt down. He looked up the trail. It curved sharply to the left, around a massive boulder about 30 feet away. She must have walked around the bend. He jogged to the boulder, his heart starting a slow, heavy thud in his chest. He rounded the corner, expecting to see her back, expecting to see the red of her jacket, but there was only the trail, stretching out into the white nothingness. "Clara!" He yelled it this time. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at his skin. He ran another 50 yards. The trail split. Deer path went off to the right. The main trail continued straight. She couldn't have gone far. It had been 30 seconds, maybe 40. He stopped and listened. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. No footsteps, no breaking twigs, no heavy breathing. Just the wind. "Clara." He screamed her name until his throat felt raw. He spun in circles, looking for color, looking for movement. He ran back to the spot where she had tied her shoe. Maybe she fell. He looked over the edge of the ravine. The rhododendrons were a tangled mess of dark green leaves below. "Clara!" He scrambled down the embankment, sliding on the wet leaves, tearing his pants on a briar. He searched for an hour. He ran up the trail, then down. He checked the deer path. He checked the ravine. The fog grew thicker, turning the world into a claustrophobic room with no walls. His mind couldn't process it. People don't just vanish. Matter doesn't cease to exist. But she was gone. By the time Silas made it back to the trailhead to get help, it was late afternoon. He was exhausted, covered in mud, his eyes wide and frantic. He flagged down a park ranger, breathless, struggling to form sentences. The ranger, a calm man named Officer Haynes, took one look at Silas and grabbed his radio. The search began within the hour. But the Smokies are vast, and the weather was worsening. A storm was moving in. The helicopters couldn't fly. The dogs had trouble with the scent because of the dampness and the shifting winds. Silas sat in the back of the ranger's truck, shivering, staring at the map. "Spread out on the hood. She's right here." It kept saying, pointing to the spot on the map. She was right in front of me. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. Night fell like a hammer. In the mountains, true dark is absolute. It is a darkness that feels heavy, pressing against your eyes. The search teams had to call it off until daybreak. It was too dangerous to be on the ridges in the storm. Silas refused to leave the trailhead. He sat in his car, the engine running to keep the heater on, staring into the black wall of the forest. He imagined Clara out there. Was she cold? Was she calling his name, wondering why he hadn't come for her? Every minute was an eternity. He replayed the moment over and over. He turned his back. He took a sip of water. That was his sin. He took a sip of water, and in that moment, the universe stole his wife. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Hundreds of volunteers arrived. Search dogs, grid searches, drones. They combed every inch of that mountain. They rappelled down the cliffs. They crawled through the rhododendron hells, those tangled thickets where a person can be 10 feet away and remain invisible. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a piece of clothing. Not a candy wrapper. It was as if Clara had been lifted into the sky. Officer Haynes sat with Silas on the 4th day. The weather had cleared, leaving the mountains majestic and indifferent to the tragedy unfolding at their feet. "Mr. Vance," the rangers said gently, "we've covered a 10-mile radius. We've checked the caves. We've checked the waterways." Silas looked at the man. He looked aged, withered. In 4 days, he had aged 10 years. "You're saying you're stopping. We're scaling back," Haynes corrected, though they both knew what that meant. The probability of survival after 4 nights in these temperatures, ... without gear, ... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Silas went home alone. The drive back down Newfound Gap Road was a hallucination. The empty seat beside him screamed at him. The silence in the car was deafening. He went back to their house. A house full of her things. Her book on the nightstand, bookmarked at page 142. Her coffee mug in the sink, waiting to be washed. The grief was not a wave. It was a tide. It came in and it stayed. It filled every room. Silas couldn't sleep in their bed. He slept on the couch, the television on low, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the miracle. Weeks turned into months. The official search was suspended. The flyers with Clara's smiling face, stapled to telephone poles and trailhead bulletin boards, began to fade in the sun. The corners curled up. The ink ran in the rain. But Silas didn't stop. Every weekend, he drove back to the Smokies. He bought his own hiking gear. Abe bought maps. He learned how to read the terrain. He hiked off-trail, bushwalking through the dense undergrowth, calling her name softly, as if she were just hiding, waiting to be found. He became a ghost of the park. The rangers knew him. They pitied him. They would see his car parked at the trailhead at dawn, and they would see it there at dusk. He walked the same loop, over and over. He looked for a sign, a shred of red fleece, a boot, a bone. He stopped living in the present. He lived entirely in the past, in the memory of her laugh, the way she smelled like vanilla and rain. He blamed himself with a ferocity that was terrifying. If he hadn't stopped for water, if he had held her hand, if they had chosen a different trail. The seasons changed. Winter brought snow that blanketed the secrets of the mountain. Spring brought wildflowers, trillium, and violets pushing up through the soil. Summer brought the heat and the haze. And then autumn came again. It had been 3 years. Silas was tired. His knees ached. His heart was a hollowed-out stone. He sat on the boulder, the same boulder where she had vanished. The moss had grown thicker. The trees were a little taller. The world had moved on, but he was stuck in that one moment of gray fog. He took a sip of water from his bottle. The same motion, the same place. He looked at the ravine below. The rhododendrons were incredibly thick there. A wall of vegetation. He had checked it a dozen times. The search teams had checked it, but something caught his eye. It was late afternoon, and the sun was hitting the mountain at a sharp angle, cutting through the canopy in shafts of golden light. One specific beam of light penetrated deep into the thicket, illuminating a small patch of earth that was usually in shadow. Something glimmered. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a leaf. It was metallic. Silas felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. He stood up, his legs trembling. He slid down the embankment, ignoring the briars tearing at his clothes. He pushed his way into the rhododendrons, crawling on his hands and knees. The branches whipped his face. The air was stagnant and smelled of rot. He reached the spot. He brushed away the dead leaves and the pine needles. It was her walking stick. It was half buried in the mud, snapped in two. And next, though it's partially covered by the growth of 3 years, was her camera bag. Silas didn't touch it at first. He just breathed. Short, ragged gasps. He fell back onto his heels and let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but a release of pressure that had been building for 1,000 days. He called the rangers. He waited. He didn't move. He guarded that spot as if it were holy ground. When Officer Haynes arrived, older now, more gray in his beard, he didn't say a word. He just put a hand on Silas's shoulder. They set up a perimeter. They brought in the forensics team. They found her remains a few yards further down, tucked into a small crevice in the rock that was invisible from above. It appeared she had stepped off the trail for privacy, perhaps, or to take a photo, and the ground had given way. She had fallen, not far, but hit her head. It would have been instant. She hadn't suffered. She hadn't waited for him in the dark. She had been there the whole time. 3 years of searching, 3 years of agony, and she was less than 50 feet from where he had last seen her. The mountain had simply folded her into its arms and hidden her away. They recovered the memory card from her camera. Remarkably, it was still intact. Silas sat in his living room. A week later, the house was quiet. The funeral was over. The closure he had prayed for had arrived, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a different kind of weight. He put the memory card into his computer. He clicked through the photos. The waterfall, the trees, a selfie of the two of them at the trailhead, grinning, full of life. He clicked to the last photo. It was taken just minutes before she died. It wasn't a photo of the view. It was a photo of him. He was walking ahead of her, his back to the camera. The image was slightly blurry, the fog beginning to creep into the edges of the frame. But you could see him, and you could tell, by the angle, that she had taken it with love. She was watching him. Silas touched the screen. He touched the image of his own back. In that moment, the guilt that had been strangling him for 3 years began to loosen its grip. She hadn't died afraid. She hadn't died thinking he had abandoned her. She died watching the person she loved. He went back to the mountains one last time. He didn't bring his pack. He didn't bring his boots. He drove to the overlook at Clingmans Dome. He stood there as the sun went down, watching the shadows lengthen over the ridges. The mist began to rise. That familiar, blue-gray smoke of the Appalachians. It swirled around the peaks, mysterious and silent. Silas didn't hate the mountain anymore. He understood it now. It was wild, and it was indifferent, and it was beautiful. "Goodbye, Clara," he whispered into the wind. The wind didn't answer. It just blew through the spruce trees, carrying the scent of rain and ancient earth. Silas turned around and walked back to his car. He left the mountains behind him, but he carried the love with him. And for the first time in 3 years, as he drove down the winding road, the fog lifted, and the road ahead was clear.